Hi, I'm Hope, and today I'm going to talk to you about the deaf and their involvement in fine arts. So we have some different categories with this. We have literature, we have art, as well as theater. And so when we're talking about literature, there's a few different classifications. We have ABC, classifier, and number stories, which means taking hand shapes that represent either different letters, different movements in space, and represent the parameters in ASL, and telling stories with those. We also have poetry, which can be expressed through both visual and written forms. So here we have a picture of a DVD of different ASL stories and poetry and works, all through sign. But then over here we have a deaf poet named David Wright, who is actually known for being an author and is known for writing poetry as a deaf individual. We also have deaf jokes and humor, as well as books by deaf authors about deafness and deafhood. So, like I mentioned, this is David Wright. He was born February 23rd, 1920. He was from South Africa, but he immigrated to England, grew up there, went to a deaf school, and ended up being a very successful author and is one of the most well-known poets and authors that is deaf. And then we have the earliest mention of writing and authors who were deaf, and that dates back to the 1400s. There was a nun, and she talked about her experience being deaf. She was deafened because of sickness in her early childhood years, and saw her deafness as a temptation and sought to educate people through her writing and encourage and support other people with deafness and to encourage them through her writing. We also have deaf jokes, and they're centered around either sign language puns or also experiences that deaf people have, like being awake in the middle of the night and not being able to remember where you were. So using sound to find out where the hearing people are and saying, that's where I am not, and finding where they are supposed to be. So then we move on to deaf theater. There's a rich history of deaf theater. The National Theater for the Deaf was founded in the early 1900s. It's been highly influential in the theatrical community for the deaf. They even have offshoots, which is the Deaf West Theater. So the National Theater for the Deaf is in Connecticut on the East Coast, and Deaf West Theater has been established on the West Coast. And then we have some ASL Performance do's and don'ts, because a lot of people are captivated by sign language. They think it's super cool. So when you are performing using ASL, you should wear clothes that contrast your skin tone. Make sure you're getting advice from deaf people for how to go about your performance, and make sure everything you do is completely accessible to the deaf individuals that you're around. So then we also have some deaf art. This is a picture called Whale. It's a painting by a man named Chuck Baird, who was a painter in the mid-1900s. Through the early 2000s, I guess. And this painting is called Whale. It uses the Y hand shape because this is how you sign whale, and it's got pictures of the water. And so it incorporates American Sign Language into that artistic aspect. He founded a company called DeVia, which means Deaf Visual Image Art. And so it has 4 different elements or parameters. And the DE stands for deaf and deaf-blind, expression or affirmation, resistance, and liberation. The V stands for view of how deaf and deaf-blind experience the world. The I stands for images, motifs, symbols of the deaf experience. And the A stands for art, activism, aesthetics, and authentic expressions of the deaf experience. So his art is featured in a gallery, as well as many other deaf artists or artists who want to share the experience of deaf-blind, or incorporate American Sign Language into their art and use that as a form of activism. Another woman who is a deaf artist, Nancy Rourke, she was a Native American and also grew up deaf. She lost her hearing in her childhood, and she also worked towards activism and using her art to express the deaf experience and show oppression through the years, as well as change in the cultural acceptance and understanding of deafness. So this is deaf and their involvement in the arts overall, and they have a really beautiful and deep, rich history.